The morning of June 19, 1944, dawned across the Philippine Sea with a deceptive tranquility that belied the cataclysm about to unfold. Aboard the fleet carrier USS Essex, Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer stood on the flight deck, watching deck crews maneuver Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters into launch position with a precision that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Around him, the steel giants of Task Force 58 stretched across the horizon 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, representing the most concentrated naval air power ever assembled in human history. What Japanese Admiral Ozawa did not know, what his intelligence officers could not have conceived, was that the American carriers beneath those grey hulls. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Possessed a capability so devastating that it would fundamentally alter the mathematics of naval warfare. These Essex-class carriers could launch aircraft at a rate that Japanese commanders, steeped in their own carrier doctrine, would have deemed physically impossible. The question that would haunt Japanese naval leadership for the remainder of the war was simple and terrible. How had American carriers become capable of projecting air power on a scale that transformed quantity into a qualitative advantage so overwhelming that Japanese counterattacks became exercises in futility? Admiral Ozawa commanded the mobile fleet with confidence born from Imperial Japan's pioneering role in carrier warfare doctrine. Japanese carriers had struck Pearl Harbor with choreographed brilliance, their 6-carrier task force launching 412 aircraft in coordinated waves that crippled the American Pacific Fleet. The Kido Butai had ranged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans for 6 months, seemingly unstoppable. Even after the losses at Midway and the attrition of the Solomons campaign, Japanese naval planners retained faith in their carrier operations expertise. Their doctrine emphasized meticulous preparation. Carrier spotting the process of positioning aircraft on the flight deck for launch required approximately 40 minutes on Japanese carriers like Shokaku and Zuikaku. Aircraft were manually pushed into position by flight deck crews, spaced about 30 feet apart for fighters and dive bombers, 33 feet for torpedo bombers. Once spotted, another 20 minutes was necessary for engine warm-up, bringing total preparation time to roughly 1 hour before the first aircraft could begin launching. This timing reflected careful engineering and operational philosophy. Japanese carriers lacked functional catapults, despite designing provisions for them in later vessels like the Shokaku class. Without catapults, aircraft required sufficient deck run to achieve takeoff speed approximately 250 feet for a Zero fighter, over 300 feet for torpedo bombers. This necessitated precise spacing and launch sequencing. The procedural rigor extended to recovery operations. When aircraft returned, carriers raised streamers to signal preparation for landing, maneuvering to achieve a resultant wind speed of exactly 15 meters per second. This standardization, Japanese planners believed, reduced pilot confusion and improved safety. The entire system reflected decades of experience in carrier operations, refined through war games and actual combat. By mid-1944, Japanese carrier doctrine had evolved into what seemed an optimal balance between operational efficiency and aircraft safety. Meanwhile, American naval architecture had undergone a transformation that Japanese intelligence systematically underestimated. The Essex-class fleet carrier, first commissioned in December 1942 with USS Essex herself, represented a revolutionary departure from treaty-limited designs. These ships displaced 27,000 tons, standard far larger than the 20,000-ton Yorktown-class predecessors. But displacement told only part of the story. The design's true innovation lay in its obsessive focus on a single operational requirement: the ability to launch the maximum possible number of aircraft in the minimum possible time. Commander Leslie Kniskern, the primary design officer at Bureau of Ships, had coordinated input from aviators, naval architects, and catapult specialists to create specifications that prioritized offensive striking power above all else. The result was a carrier whose dimensions and systems were optimized for what American doctrine called the deck load strike, launching as rapidly as possible every aircraft that could be spotted on the flight deck beforehand. The Essex's flight deck measured 872 feet long by 109 feet wide on the original short hull variants, later extended to 888 feet on long hull versions. This expansive deck could accommodate 90 aircraft spotted simultaneously, with room for precise positioning that maximized launch efficiency. More importantly, the deck's layout incorporated innovations specifically designed to accelerate operations. The most significant innovation was the deck edge elevator positioned on the port side, outboard of the flight deck's edge. This elevator, first proven on the experimental carrier Wasp, transformed operational tempo. Unlike centerline elevators that cut through the flight deck and blocked aircraft movement during operation, the deck edge design allowed simultaneous launching and recovery operations. Aircraft could be brought up from the hangar while launches proceeded uninterrupted. The hangar deck itself became a staging area where aircraft could warm engines before being elevated to the flight deck already running, eliminating the 20-minute warm-up period that Japanese carriers required on deck. Two additional innovations accelerated the process beyond Japanese conception. First, American aircraft featured tightly folding wings that allowed more compact spacing on deck. By 1943, American carriers began spotting aircraft with wings still folded, permitting density that Japanese spotting procedures couldn't match. Second, and perhaps most critically, American carriers deployed specialized jeeps, small tractors, equipped to hitch to aircraft that moved planes far more rapidly than manual pushing. Flight deck crews could reposition aircraft in minutes rather than the extended periods required for manual handling. But the true force multiplier remained invisible to Japanese observers. American carriers possessed functional catapults. The H-4 catapult system, steam-powered and reliable, could accelerate heavily loaded aircraft to takeoff speed using only a fraction of the deck run required for unassisted launches. This meant that heavily armed and fueled strike aircraft carrying bombs, torpedoes, and full ammunition loads that increased gross weight substantially could launch from positions far aft on the deck. Where Japanese doctrine required clearing the entire forward deck for torpedo bomber launches, American catapults allowed mixing of aircraft types during a single launch cycle. The strategic implications were profound. An Essex-class carrier could spot its entire air group on deck, while another full deck load warmed up in the hangar. When the order came to launch, the deck edge elevator brought hangar aircraft up continuously, while those already spotted began launching. Catapults handled the heaviest aircraft, while lighter fighters rolled off under their own power. The process resembled an assembly line of aerial destruction, with aircraft launching at intervals measured in seconds rather than minutes. Intelligence reports reaching Admiral Ozawa's staff contained fragments of this reality, but the information failed to coalesce into comprehension. Japanese scouts had observed American carriers during strikes against Marcus Island and Wake. They reported large numbers of aircraft launched, but the speed of those launches seemed to be exaggerated by the fog of combat. Japanese analysts, operating from their own carrier experience, assumed American carriers must be launching from multiple ships simultaneously, that the Americans simply had more carriers than Japanese forces could muster. This assumption contained truth but missed the deeper transformation. Yes, Task Force 58 fielded 15 carriers against Ozawa's 9, but the qualitative difference in launch capability meant that each American carrier effectively multiplied its striking power through operational tempo. By the time Japanese carriers completed spotting and launching their first strike wave, an Essex-class carrier had already launched its first wave, begun recovering combat air patrol, and started preparing a second strike. The Americans weren't just winning through numbers, they were operating on a different timescale entirely. Admiral Ozawa's plan for the decisive battle in the Philippine Sea reflected traditional carrier warfare theory. His mobile fleet would exploit the longer range of Japanese aircraft, particularly the A-6M0 fighter and the D-4Y Judy dive bomber, to strike American forces while remaining beyond the range of American counterstrike. Japanese aircraft would shuttle between Ozawa's carriers and air bases on Guam and Saipan, hitting the Americans coming and going in a devastating cycle. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The plan assumed rough parity in launch capabilities that both sides would spend similar amounts of time preparing and launching strike packages. Reality shattered those assumptions with brutal efficiency. When American radar detected the first Japanese strike wave at 1000 hours, still 150 miles distant, Admiral Mark Mitcher's carriers executed a launch sequence that Japanese Doctrine deemed impossible. At 10:23, Task Force 58 turned into the wind and began launching every available fighter. The Essex alone put fighters into the air in a continuous stream, with aircraft rolling off the forward flight deck, while the catapults hurled more from amidships positions. Other carriers replicated this tempo across the task force. By 10:36, when Lieutenant Commander Brewer led 11 Hellcats from Essex into position for the first interception, the American carriers had already launched a fighter screen so dense that Japanese strike aircraft would have to fight through multiple defensive layers before reaching their targets. This was not the ponderous launch sequence Japanese intelligence expected. This was something new, a carrier force that could generate combat air patrol, launch strike packages, and respot for additional operations in timeframes that broke every assumption about carrier warfare timing. As Brewer's Hellcats closed with the approaching Japanese aircraft, beginning the engagement that would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the full scope of American carrier efficiency remained hidden from Japanese observers. They saw only the immediate tactical result: massive fighter screens appearing with impossible rapidity, overwhelming their strike forces through sheer weight of numbers vectored with radar precision. The deeper strategic reality would only become apparent as the battle progressed. American carriers weren't simply launching large numbers of aircraft, they were sustaining continuous operations at a tempo that Japanese carriers, bound by their manual spotting procedures and lack of catapults, could never match. When Japanese strike aircraft finally reached American ships, having fought through multiple fighter interceptions that claimed most of their number, they found targets protected by anti-aircraft fire so intense that few survived to attack. Of those that did, most failed to score hits on nimble American carriers that maneuvered aggressively while maintaining launch operations. Meanwhile, Essex and her sister ships had already recovered their combat air patrol, rearmed and refueled those aircraft, and positioned them for launch again. The efficiency wasn't merely impressive, it represented a fundamental transformation in naval warfare. Carriers had evolved from platforms that launched strikes in discrete operations, with lengthy intervals between missions, into continuous aircraft projection systems that sustained air operations like land-based airfields. This was the reality that Japanese admirals had failed to anticipate. American carriers had become floating air bases, capable of generating and sustaining air superiority through operational tempo, rather than merely through numerical superiority or pilot skill. The specific technical capabilities that enabled this transformation were known to American personnel, but remained obscure to Japanese intelligence. An Essex-class carrier like the USS Essex or USS Lexington could indeed launch extraordinary numbers of aircraft in remarkably short timeframes when all systems functioned optimally. While exact launch times varied based on aircraft types, weather conditions, and tactical situation, the Essex-class demonstrated during operations that they could put their entire air group airborne in timeframes that would have required multiple carriers using Japanese procedures. The operational reports spoke of launch cycles measured in minutes, where Japanese counterparts required most of an hour. Admiral Ozawa's shock on June 19 came not from a single devastating blow, but from the cumulative realization that every assumption underpinning his battle plan had proved false. His aircraft didn't shuttle successfully between carriers and island bases because American strikes had devastated those bases before the battle began. His carrier aircraft couldn't penetrate American defenses because those defenses launched with such rapidity that Japanese strike packages faced overwhelming opposition before reaching attack positions. And when American carriers finally launched their own strike on June 20th, despite being at the extreme range of their aircraft, they put hundreds of aircraft into the air in timeframes that left Japanese fleet air defense coordinators unable to organize effective response. The material evidence of American carrier efficiency became undeniable, as the Battle of the Philippine Sea progressed beyond its initial air combat phase. Task Force 58's fighters had destroyed approximately 476 Japanese aircraft during June 19 alone, with pilot accounts consistently emphasizing the sheer density of defending American fighters. Japanese pilots who survived reported encountering wave after wave of F-6F Hellcats, suggesting that American carriers must possess far more aircraft than intelligence estimates indicated. But the truth was more fundamental. The same American carriers were launching, recovering, rearming, and relaunching their fighters in continuous cycles that multiplied their effective strength. Captain David McCampbell, Air Group Commander aboard Essex, exemplified this operational tempo. On the morning of June 19, he shot down 5 Japanese aircraft during the initial interceptions. His aircraft returned to Essex, where deck crews rearmed and refueled it with practiced efficiency honed through months of continuous operations. By afternoon, McCampbell was airborne again, adding 2 more kills to his tally. This cycle launch, engage, recover, rearm, relaunch proceeded at speeds that Japanese carriers, with their manual handling procedures and hour-long spotting times, simply could not replicate. The Japanese could launch powerful strikes, but they couldn't sustain the kind of continuous air operations that American carriers had made standard procedure. The technical specifications underlying this capability were straightforward but devastating in their implications. An Essex-class carrier's aviation fuel capacity totaled 240,000 gallons, stored in separate tanks with sophisticated pumping systems that allowed rapid refueling of multiple aircraft simultaneously. Magazine capacity for aviation ordnance exceeded previous carrier classes substantially, with ammunition hoists positioned to minimize the time required to bring weapons from storage to flight deck. These seemingly mundane logistical details translated directly into operational tempo. American carriers could sustain high-intensity operations longer than Japanese counterparts before requiring replenishment from fleet oilers and ammunition ships. Moreover, American damage control procedures reflected lessons learned from observing British carrier operations and preparing for worst-case scenarios. Essex-class carriers featured compartmentalization systems that isolated damage, firefighting equipment positioned throughout the ship, and damage control parties trained to respond instantly to battle damage. This wasn't mere defensive preparation, it was operational insurance that allowed carriers to remain in action despite damage that would cripple vessels lacking such systems. USS Franklin and USS Bunker Hill would later demonstrate this survivability dramatically, remaining afloat and eventually returning to service, despite catastrophic damage that would have sunk earlier carrier designs. The human element complemented technical advantages. American naval aviation training programs, while stretched thin by rapid expansion, maintained systematic approaches to pilot preparation. Experienced pilots rotated back from the Pacific to train new aviators, creating a knowledge transfer system that preserved tactical wisdom earned in combat. Japanese training programs, devastated by attrition and constrained by fuel shortages, could not replace losses with pilots of equivalent quality. By mid-1944, the average American carrier pilot possessed substantially more flight hours than his Japanese counterpart, particularly in tactics specific to the F-6F Hellcat and the latest American strike aircraft. This training advantage magnified the operational tempo advantages of American carriers. Skilled pilots launched more efficiently, formed up faster, executed strikes more effectively, and landed more reliably. The combination of superior launch systems and superior pilots created a force multiplication effect where the whole exceeded the sum of its parts. An Essex-class carrier wasn't simply a platform with catapults and efficient elevators. It was an integrated weapons system where technology and training reinforced each other to produce combat effectiveness beyond what either element could achieve independently. The evening of June 19 found Admiral Ozawa in a state of bewildered rage aboard his flagship Zuikaku. Reports filtering back from surviving pilots painted an impossible picture. American carriers launching continuous streams of fighters, combat air patrol so dense it appeared as if every American carrier had doubled its aircraft complement, and defensive fire so intense that few Japanese aircraft survived to attack. Intelligence officers struggled to reconcile these reports with their understanding of American carrier capabilities. Some suggested that American forces included far more carriers than reconnaissance had detected. Others theorized that American aircraft must have far greater endurance than known models, allowing them to remain airborne for extended periods before requiring recovery and refueling. The truth that American carriers simply launched, recovered, and relaunched aircraft with such speed that they sustained continuous air operations remained outside Japanese conceptual frameworks. Their own carrier experience suggested that such tempo was physically impossible given the time required for spotting, launching, recovery, and respot for the next mission. What they failed to grasp was that American carriers had essentially eliminated or drastically reduced each of those time penalties through systematic engineering and doctrinal innovation. June 20th brought the second phase of the battle, when American carriers finally launched their own strikes against Ozawa's mobile fleet. The decision to launch came late in the afternoon, with Admiral Mitchell fully aware that aircraft would be recovering in darkness, a hazardous evolution under the best circumstances. But the opportunity to strike the withdrawing Japanese fleet outweighed the risks. At 1600 hours, Task Force 58 turned into the wind and executed a launch sequence that demonstrated American carrier efficiency under pressure. 216 aircraft launched in time frames that left Japanese defenders minimal warning before strike packages arrived. The attack itself, while not achieving the overwhelming success of June 19th's defensive operations, nevertheless demonstrated American carriers' offensive striking power. American aircraft sank the carrier Hio, damaged several other major warships, and destroyed additional Japanese aircraft in combat over the mobile fleet. But the most remarkable aspect of June 20th's operations came during the recovery phase. As darkness fell and fuel-depleted American aircraft began returning to Task Force 58, Admiral Mitchell made a decision that would become legendary in naval aviation history. He ordered all ships to turn on their lights, illuminating the carrier task force, despite the risk of revealing their position to Japanese submarines or aircraft. The resulting recovery operations, with exhausted pilots landing on illuminated carriers at night, demonstrated both the confidence American commanders had in their ships' capabilities and the proficiency of American aviators. While many aircraft ditched due to fuel exhaustion, the majority recovered successfully despite conditions that would have been considered prohibitively dangerous just 2 years earlier. Destroyer crews, working through the night, rescued dozens of downed aircrews from the dark waters. The losses were significant, over 80 aircraft and fewer than 50 aircrew killed or missing, but the operation succeeded in recovering most pilots and demonstrated that American carriers could sustain operations under conditions Japanese carriers would have considered impossible. The material comparison between American and Japanese carrier operations became even more stark when examining post-battle analysis. Task Force 58 had launched thousands of sorties over 2 days of operations. American carriers had maintained continuous combat air patrol, launched multiple strike packages, recovered and rearmed aircraft repeatedly, and sustained operations through day and night. Japanese carriers, by contrast, had managed to launch 4 major strike waves on June 19th before their operational capability essentially collapsed due to aircraft losses and the failure of their shuttle bombing plan. The disparity wasn't simply about numbers of aircraft or carriers, it reflected fundamental differences in operational capability per carrier. An Essex-class carrier operating at peak efficiency could generate combat sorties at rates that Japanese carriers, constrained by manual handling and lack of catapults, could not match even in optimal conditions. This force multiplication through operational tempo meant that Task Force 58's 15 carriers didn't simply outnumber Ozawa's 9 carriers by a ratio of 5-3, the effective striking power disparity was far greater because American carriers could surge their aircraft at rates that sustained pressure Japanese carriers couldn't replicate. Every hour of sustained operations magnified American advantages as Japanese carriers struggled to maintain sortie rates, while American carriers cycled aircraft through launch, recover, rearm, relaunch sequences with mechanical precision. The technological foundation enabling this tempo remained largely invisible to Japanese observers. They could see the results: masses of American aircraft appearing with startling rapidity, but understanding the systems producing those results required insight into American carrier design that Japanese intelligence lacked. The combination of deck-edge elevators, functional catapults, efficient refueling and rearming procedures, jeep tractors for rapid aircraft movement, and doctrine emphasizing maximum sortie generation created operational capabilities qualitatively different from Japanese carrier operations. American carriers had, in effect, industrialized air operations at sea, applying mass production principles to the launch and recovery of strike aircraft. This industrialization of carrier operations reflected broader American advantages in the Pacific War. Industrial capacity allowed the United States to build 24 Essex-class carriers between 1942 and 1946, plus numerous light carriers and escort carriers, but sheer numbers told only part of the story. Each Essex-class carrier represented not just a hull and aircraft, but an integrated system optimized for maximum combat effectiveness. The design philosophy prioritized offensive striking power above all else, accepting reduced armor protection in exchange for larger air groups and higher sortie generation rates. This trade-off, controversial among some American naval officers who preferred armored flight decks like British carriers, proved devastatingly effective in the Pacific's carrier warfare environment. The aftermath of the Battle of the Philippine Sea validated American carrier doctrine completely. Japanese carrier aviation never recovered from the losses sustained during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The combination of aircraft losses, approximately 476 carrier aircraft, plus numerous land-based aircraft and pilot casualties, created a gap that Japanese training programs couldn't fill. Subsequent Japanese carrier operations became increasingly tentative, constrained by the knowledge that American carrier air groups possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers, quality, and operational tempo. By late 1944, when Japanese carriers sortied during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, they served primarily as decoys, their air groups so depleted and undertrained that they couldn't pose serious threats to American forces. The strategic consequences rippled through the remainder of the Pacific War. American carrier air groups, operating from the fast carrier task forces, established air superiority over any area within range of their strike aircraft. This mobile air superiority enabled the island-hopping campaign that brought American forces progressively closer to Japan. Essex-class carriers, supported by their light carrier sisters and escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, became the primary striking arm of the Pacific Fleet. Their ability to sustain high-tempo operations meant they could support amphibious landings, strike enemy installations, and defend against counterattacks simultaneously, a multi-mission capability that previous carrier designs couldn't match. Individual Essex-class carriers built remarkable combat records. USS Essex herself earned 13 battle stars, participating in operations from the Gilberts through the final strikes on Japan. USS Intrepid survived multiple kamikaze hits, testament to the class's survivability despite lacking armored flight decks. USS Lexington, the second ship to bear that name, served as Admiral Mitchell's flagship through much of 1944, coordinating task force operations from her flag bridge. Each carrier developed distinctive characteristics and crew cultures, but all shared the fundamental capability that defined the class: the ability to generate and sustain air operations at tempos that overwhelmed enemy opposition through sheer operational intensity. The Japanese recognition of their defeat in carrier warfare came gradually and painfully. Admiral Ozawa, interrogated after the war, acknowledged that American carrier operations had achieved effectiveness levels Japanese planners never anticipated. Specifically, he noted that the speed and density of American carrier launches had made it impossible to conduct the kind of coordinated strikes that Japanese doctrine emphasized. By the time Japanese strike packages assembled and began approaching American forces, they faced defensive fighter screens so numerous and well coordinated that penetrating to attack carriers became a suicide mission rather than a tactical challenge. Japanese naval aviation analysts, examining captured documents and interviewing American personnel after the war, finally understood the technical foundations of American carrier efficiency. The deck-edge elevator innovation particularly impressed Japanese engineers, who recognized immediately how it transformed operational tempo. Similarly, American catapult systems, which Japanese engineers had attempted to develop but never perfected for carrier use, became obvious force multipliers that explained much of the sortie generation disparity Japanese crews had observed in combat. The systematic integration of these technologies into a coherent operational doctrine represented naval engineering and tactical thinking that Japanese programs, constrained by resource limitations and institutional conservatism, had failed to match. The human cost of these operational differences extended far beyond immediate battle casualties. Thousands of Japanese naval aviators died during the latter half of the Pacific War, flying missions against American forces whose carrier air groups possessed overwhelming advantages in training, equipment, and support. American casualties, while substantial, remained proportionally lower due to the effectiveness of carrier-based fighter cover and the ability to dominate aerial combat through superior numbers and coordination. The families of pilots on both sides bore the weight of decisions made by naval architects and strategists years earlier, when carrier designs were finalized and operational doctrines established. American society celebrated the success of its carrier forces, though the Navy Department carefully managed information to protect classified capabilities. The specific technical features that enabled rapid launch operations remained classified information, with public accounts emphasizing pilot skill and bravery rather than the engineering innovations that multiplied pilot effectiveness. This security-driven vagueness ironically reinforced Japanese misconceptions about American carrier capabilities, with some Japanese planners continuing to attribute American success primarily to numerical superiority rather than recognizing the qualitative advantages each American carrier possessed. The legacy of Essex-class carrier operations extended well beyond World War II. The class's success validated the fast carrier task force concept, establishing carrier aviation as the primary striking arm of naval forces in the jet age. Post-war carrier designs incorporated lessons learned from Essex-class operations, including the critical importance of rapid launch and recovery capabilities, the value of deck-edge elevators, and the necessity of catapults for operating increasingly heavy aircraft. Many Essex-class carriers underwent extensive modernization programs during the 1950s, receiving angled flight decks, strengthened catapults, and updated electronics that allowed them to operate jet aircraft effectively. The operational principles pioneered by Essex-class carriers prioritizing sortie generation, emphasizing operational tempo, integrating technology and training into coherent systems became foundational elements of American naval aviation doctrine. When later carrier, classes like the Forrestal and Enterprise nuclear-powered carriers entered service, they built upon capabilities first demonstrated by Essex-class ships during the Pacific War. The evolution of carrier warfare from the deck-load strikes of 1944 to the precision strike capabilities of modern carrier air wings reflected continuous refinement of principles established when Essex and her sisters proved that carriers could sustain air operations at tempos that transformed naval warfare fundamentally. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.